good afternoon, everyone. Good evening or good morning, depending on where you are. And thank you all for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking the time to join, and time is quite precious, a precious currency in our current world. So thank you very much. So my name is Savinio Carluccio, and today I'll be your host in my role as Program Director for the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure. And I'd like to say ICSI for short, we call it ICSI. So a few words on ICSI in case you don't know us. So ICSI is the biggest engineering-led coalition for infrastructure sustainability and resilience in the world, and its founding members are the American Society of Civil Engineers, the Institution of Civil Engineers, the Global Covenant of Mayors, the Resilience Shift, and WSP. ICSI aims to bring together the entire value chain of infrastructure and unlock the opportunity of using engineers as a driving force for action and impact. We want to welcome all of you and make you feel part of this session. And we have a couple of live polls planned for, as well as a live Q&A session. However, you can post your questions throughout the session or comment in the chat, and we will do our best to reply to as many as we can. And please note that this session is being recorded. So today we want to focus on infrastructure practitioners and their pains and their needs to be able to implement climate resilience in their day jobs. So we also want to raise awareness about a flagship project of ICSI called Infrastructure Pathways that is led by the Resilience Shift in partnership with Arup. We will tell you more about the Infrastructure Pathways later in the session, but I want to say a few words about the Resilience Shift in case you don't know what that is. Resilience Shift's mission is to be a global hub for resilience best practice, accelerating critical infrastructure resilience across engineering and business sectors. Resilience Shift aims to influence policymakers and practitioners and empower them to shift their behaviors and implement innovative approaches to commissioning, design, and operation of infrastructure. So today we've invited 4 panelists to represent different actors contributing in different ways to the development of climate resilient infrastructure. It is my pleasure to introduce our panelists now. And joining us today are Kristen Guida, who's been working for 15 years coordinating partnerships on climate change adaptation, currently as manager of the London Climate Change Partnership and previously at Climate Southeast. Her major interest is in facilitating the conversation between climate science and practice and bringing together people and ideas from across sectors to respond to social and environmental challenges presented by climate change. We also have Miriam McLennan, who's a highly experienced civil engineer and passionate environmentalist. Her career spans a few decades in various versions of Network Rail, and it is focused on geotechnical asset management. Her current role is the leading the Southern region's weather resilience and climate change adaptation strategy, as well as leading learning and innovation. Miriam's philosophy is that the learning creates action, that creates results, and that raising the knowledge of engineers in this area and encouragement of new actions will lead us to a resilient future. And we now also have Abhilash Panda, who has nearly 16 years experience in international development, humanitarian response, climate and disaster resilience, and at the United Nations. As Deputy Chief for Intergovernmental Processes Partnership Branch and the Head of Infrastructure Resilience, he oversees UNDRR's engagement in the areas of risk-informed investment and sustainability of infrastructure globally. And finally, Dr. Gianluca Pescaroli is a lecturer in business continuity and organizational resilience at UCL, University College London. His research investigates how to build and improve the continuity of operation during disruptive events, how to minimize their impacts, and how to increase the resilience of the public and private sectors. So welcome to our panelists. We will now watch a short video on that presents some of the resilience challenges faced by practitioners. Hopefully the video will start shortly. Here we are.
I think, Sabina, you are muted.
Thank you. I muted myself during the video. Thank you for that. So the video provided a good introduction to our first panel discussion, and that will be focused on challenges and barriers to implementing climate resilience in infrastructure. But before I start, I would like to make you aware that polling questions will appear on your screen, and so it would be great if you could take part. So if you can, the first polling question could be launched while we proceed to start the first panel discussion. So I'd like to ask our panelists, from your perspective and experience, what are the challenges that climate change poses to infrastructure practitioners? And what are the barriers to implementation of climate resilience? So I'd like to start, if you could please, Abhilash, I would like to start with you. If you could please share your views and perspective.
Thank you very much, Sabina, and thank you again for the invitation today and for this opportunity to discuss and hear definitely the opinions and feedback from the esteemed guests and experts on the panel. This is a very interesting and a very necessary topic, and view of the short time that we have, let me briefly highlight a few things that we normally come across in the periphery of the work that we do. We now have a number of, let's say, climate change scenarios provided by scientific hazard research, and we can expect to a certain degree and predict some of the potential harmful hazards of the future, let's say, for most of the scenarios. But as you see from COVID-19, what it has taught us is that risk is not static. What is more, the pandemic taught us is that risks are so interconnected and can expand and push one another in any direction that they would like to. Now, in today's interconnected world, one hazard can have cascading impacts across economic, social, environmental, political systems, and it does not respect any borders. So is infrastructure. It's not just within the border, it's the interconnection amongst borders that the infrastructure lays out to. The second point, which you may be aware of, and you are very much well aware, I'm sure, is that the infrastructure does not operate in a standalone manner, but is actually a system of systems, and the normal and continuous provision of critical services depends on the level of resilience of the whole network of interconnected assets and the interrelated sectors behind them. Now, this requires a lot more planning and resources than originally anticipated. And before anything else, comprehensive understanding of risk, and not just based on historical evidence, but also what could potentially happen in the future, included with capacity is the bedrock of the process. Now, to add, there is actually, at least we have not come across, and pardon me if that's a mistake, there is no common understanding of what exactly is resilience of infrastructure and what does it constitute. We do not see there are actually global benchmarks to baseline resilience of infrastructure, which makes it very difficult for at least the governments whom we deal with as an UN institution, and also with investors, to delineate what sort of policies and measures to take so that resilience is integrated in a meaningful way. Now, this leads me to the issue of also insufficient financing and weak regulatory frameworks. Now, I'm not going to pick one country or the other, but in general, as there is no understanding of what constitutes resilience of infrastructure, there is also no clear understanding by all involved stakeholders, be it the designer, the developer, the operator, the manager, of the benefits of investing in resilience. Is it actually the 1:4? Is it actually the 1:10? And when it's going to happen? When do I see the benefit? Is it today or is it 10 years? As well as there are not enough incentives provided to investors, in particular the private sector ones, to spare these additional funds for resilience. For us as a global institution trying to support as many member states we can, there is yet another challenge, and that is the issue of scale. And when you talk about scale, there are n number of issues behind it. Capacity, knowledge, data, these are just few among many. Now, before I hand it back to you, one last thing. If you ask investors in general, and not picking again on what the challenges they see. One of the major issues and bottleneck is that there is a lack of pipeline of infrastructure projects. Now, if there is no strong commitment coming in and there is no model behind pipeline of projects, it's not going to matter if it's actually resilient or not resilient. So I'll stop with that and give it back to you.
Great, thank you, Abhilash. That's a lot, really to unpack, and a lot of challenges definitely for the practitioner across the infrastructure life cycle. So can I get, Kristen, your views on this from your perspective, and kind of like you maybe working in policy and also more on the kind of climate change aspects?
Sure, thanks, Sabina, and thanks for having me along today. It's really nice to be here. So yeah, I think Abhilash, I definitely, a lot of what he said resonated with me. I think, there are the issues that we see around defining resilience, and coming up with some sort of an agreed definition, working out what we're planning for, like what scenarios, and kind of coming up with some agreement about what's good enough and what levels of failure we might or might not accept. And of course, the issue of, concurrent risks and risks from cascading failures because of infrastructure interdependency that Abhilash also mentioned, and that I know Gianluca will be able to say more about. But I think when I was thinking about particularly climate resilience, specifically about climate, two things really kind of jump out at me. One is about timescales. Adaptation to climate change or climate resilience isn't about, managing today's climate risk or weather risks. To be doing adaptation, you need to be thinking longer term, planning for, and, managing the risks that are going to manifest themselves over the lifetime of the decisions that you're making or the things that you're building. And we don't tend to be very good at thinking longer term. I think we know that climate change is going to exacerbate other risks, but that need to think longer term in and of itself is also going to complicate, other challenges or challenge organizational cultures. For example, budgets. I think Abhilash mentioned this. How do you justify spending money on something when you don't know if you're going to realize the benefits for a long time? I mean, we already have huge challenges in kind of demonstrating the benefits of resilience measures in general, because effectively you're trying to prove that you caused something not to happen, right? Mm-hmm. So you add to that the kind of time lag aspect, and then people in finance start to get quite twitchy. Also, there's that issue of how broadly or narrowly you define the benefit, and how we value benefits. So that's the one thing I think. And the second challenge I think in relation to climate change in particular is where it sometimes sits within an organization. I think if it's got the label of climate, this is in my own experience with partners, then it often ends up sitting, in a team, if you're lucky, or with a person who looks after, environment, sustainability, net zero waste, green infrastructure, and on all of those types of things. And adaptation or climate resilience is, not to be too precious about it, but it's a really different skill set. It's much more about risk management, and it requires a coherent strategic view and coordination across an organization so that you can recognize where the different priorities might be in tension with one another, and, where trade-offs might have to be made. So for example, climate resilience is not efficient always, those things can be in conflict. So you need to be able to kind of coordinate to bring in people like, your asset managers, your operations, your suppliers, your maintenance, business continuity, policy, strategy, all sorts of stakeholders within and even outside your organization. And that coordination is, often a bigger job than I think perhaps is recognized in any, single job description as written. But, we've seen heroic efforts within, organizations that I work with, like Network Rail, like TfL, to be able to engage across different organizations and within their organizations, and also to get commitment from leadership, which is also hugely important. So I think the kinds of things that specifically jumped out at me, but there are so many of those kinds of barriers. But I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Kristen. And before I ask the other two panelists, I'd like to, if possible, to visualize the results of the first poll. So I hope you can see, you can all see now what it looks like. We've asked the audience to kind of categorize themselves in where do they fit, and we get we've got quite a strong representation from designers, today in the audience, some government, some contractor, and some education. Other is, like we probably need to kind of define what other is, and we don't seem to have anyone representing owner operators or investors today. And so if we can, while I now move on to kind of getting Miriam's views, could launch the next polling question, please. So Miriam, you probably, well, you most definitely have a quite different perspective, in terms of actually putting this into practice in your day job. Can you just tell us what the challenges and barriers are for you? Oh, and can you unmute yourself, please? Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much, Sabina. So can I just say thank you very much for having me here. This is a real honour, and I love it every time I get together with sort of different people. And this is such a diverse audience for me, which is brilliant. And I can see there's hardly anyone from owner operators, which probably means there's no one from Network Rail either. So yeah, I'm just really excited that we can just share so many different ideas and approaches. Having said which, I've written down sort of my main 3 challenge areas that I wanted to talk about. Sort of, it is vast, but I sort of tried to group them. And it comes back to some really similar points that Abhilash and Kirsten have raised. So the first one was about system thinking. And there's really no point in having a railway if the communities are flooded and unable to function. And you can't have a railway if no one can get to the trains to drive them, or if there's no power to make the trains run. So this interdependency and these sort of shared vulnerabilities are extremely important, and working together, we all need to build that, and I know Abhilash mentioned it, that target of resilience, that common understanding of what is resilience. We all sort of need to share it, because there's no point having I remember one year when the snow came and the railways ran, but no one could get to the train station. So there's really no point running those trains because everyone was snowed in and the schools were shut. So, there were no people to go into the system. And so it very much is sort of moving forward together. And I think sort of thinking about the funding and the short-termism, I was at a conference organised by the Environment Agency the other day, and there was something very important there about partnerships and how, Network Rail, we are doing, at the moment, we're very much in the throes of working out our sort of vulnerability and criticality assessment so we can embark on our pathway journey. But actually, there's no point in us sort of necessarily massively reinforcing some of our assets, because it's such a common problem, like, sort of coastal defences and things like that, then it might be something the Environment Agency is already working on, or it might be something someone else. And so there's a common solution. And so in terms of funding, there's a real opportunity, and we've got a couple of really good sort of examples of best practice where we've collaborated and shared the costs and all won, from the common value. So the second thing that I've written down was about the short-termism. And, the thing that brings me hope with that is, at the moment we strive for efficiency in the public, the public sector. It's sort of, I suppose it's our shareholder equivalent of obviously giving money back to the taxpayer. And but with resilience schemes, and I'm pretty sure I read it on the ICSE website, the return on investment is one in 4. So every pound spent now is £4 back in the pocket later. So, in terms of extending that view, if we can get our regulators to change the sort of the hard coding in our KPIs and objectives, then, there's real hope that actually we can demonstrate that this isn't an inefficient thing to do and that there's value to be gained. And in terms of sort of the trading off, our sort of short-term versus long-term, short-term for us, I suppose, is our 5-year control periods, the funding sort of windows that we get. And so short-term would be something that returns within that 5 years. And, sort of very few of these things do. But, once you have committed to spending, I think about our geotechnical portfolio, our civils portfolio, we don't replace, I think probably in a control period, maybe sort of 10% of our assets. So, really slow progress. And we don't have very many opportunities to enhance things in line with a renewal. But retrofitting things later is going to be extremely expensive. So, how much more non-resilience can we afford really to lock in with every kind of project spent, sort of without having resilient aims? And the third thing that I wrote down is that, so engineers, I think, are a naturally sort of curious and inventive and creative bunch. And we're really good at coming up with solutions. And we've all got all sorts of little bits of best practice squirreled away. But the challenge is, how do you change the culture? How do you take what someone's invented and share it? How do you lock it into the policies and the KPIs? Because otherwise you have all these little initiatives and people working extremely hard and being extremely creative and inventive, but it doesn't become sort of common and shared. And I just think if we could do that, then it would be sort of very much shoulders of giants, and you can keep on building on what the last person has done, and just accelerate that rate of change.
Sorry, muted. Thank you, Miriam. Really good to hear this from you, and gives me hope. I think, like people like you are in the organizations like Network REL wanted to implement it. So thank you for that. And then finally, Gianluca, if you can give us like a bit of your peace of mind on this, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I will try to also give an idea about how things can look at the way ahead. The thing is that as the speakers of the panel were highlighting already, risk is dynamic, scenario are complex, cascading effects are everywhere. We are dealing with an environment that is much different than the one that were used 10 and 15, 20 years ago. And things can go wrong, and they're not going wrong just on the side of one infrastructure. Is how the system look like, how they interact together. And the key issue becomes then achieving flexibility, going beyond hazard thinking. So becoming a bit risk agnostic, as somebody said, and finding a way of doing capacity building across departments. So finding synergies, speaking the common languages, finding the KPI that on which we can work together, two departments of the same organization, calling resilience in a different way. On my perspective, I see also that there is still a dichotomy between short and long term. The short term for me is the one of continuity management, emergency management, and basically preparing for the immediate impact of something, like my neighbor cutting the grass with a huge garden arriving exactly at the moment in which I'm speaking nearby. Plus the longer term, what we are not seeing, but what is really climate change now? I mean, climate change, we were used to think something in the future at some point far away. It is now. It is what we are living in the city. And the synergy we can put down in how we keep operation running, we create capacity to answer to challenges such as COVID-19, even if they are not strictly climate change related. And to anything else that is coming up versus longer term, something else that is in other departments with other people that works on it, and how we merge them together, creating sustainability, for example. So how we use better our resources, and we use them more efficiently to do one thing, four things. So it's a bit, the problem is shaking off from a mentality where what was climate resilience was a remote possibility to something real now. And whatever we are doing on one side of resilience is also the same thing, or can be potentially, if we're doing it right, for something that can be independently by the threats or the risk we are facing in the short term. So stress testing, understanding where are we weak in the both scenarios, in both short term, longer term, and work there in the common point of failure.
Great, thank you, Gianluca. Thank you for your contribution, and thank you to everyone on the panel. And the audience, please keep on sharing your views or experience in the chat, or add comments and questions. We will pick up the questions at the end. Towards the end, we have a Q&A session, and so please keep on popping your question in the chat. And if your question is for a specific panelist, please remember to include her or his name. So in this session today, we don't just want to be talking about problems and challenges. We also want to be starting to share what the solutions might be. And, like if it's something that is useful but doesn't exist, what would that be? So we now have another video to share with you, and then this time he's presenting a bit of information about infrastructure pathways, which is one we hope is one of the resources that will be helpful to you. So please, if we can play this video, that'd be great. Thank you. So infrastructure pathways doesn't just intend to provide a kind of guidance, so user handbook of what exists out there, but also some sort of a framework and a mechanism for more informed decision making and improved coordination. So there's a key concept, I think, of collective impact that I think is emerging more and more. And if this needs to be the decade of action, so 2020, 2030, then we cannot be, and we need to turn the tide, we cannot be doing it in isolation. We need to kind of work together. And so that collective impact is key. So we're currently working on infrastructure, developing and finalizing infrastructure pathways. As you could see from the video, is a publication, but also a website. And it will be launched in the autumn in the run-up to COP26. So I'd like to go back to our panelists now and shift the focus of the discussion away from challenges and barriers and then more into the solutions and resources and examples of what works or what looks good or helps. But before I ask my questions to the panel, we want to launch a final polling question. If that can be launched, please. So, and also if you have questions for our panelists, again, keep on asking. Our panelists can answer in the chat box if they want to, and they can be picked up at the end of the Q&A session. And if you got a question on infrastructure pathways, then the team is in the audience and they can answer. They're very happy to answer your questions. So back to our panel. I'd like to ask this question. So can you share examples of existing solutions, initiatives, or resources that are available to practitioners to help them out in implementing climate resilience? And if something doesn't exist, what would that be? And as a slightly separate question, if we wanted to pick up on how could greater collective impact could be achieved? That's slightly separate from the resources, but if you wanted to touch on that, that'd be good. So Gianluca, this time I'm starting with you. I mean, you are in a privileged position that you're forming the next generation of practitioners. So hopefully then you're equipping them, with the knowledge and the resources that they need. But what's in your experience? What would you like to highlight in terms of, as I said, solutions, but also initiatives?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I want to highlight is that we tend to think that answering to complex events is a matter of rocket science. This is not rocket science 90% of the time. It is starting from the basic of some of my colleagues were already addressing before, or what I was mentioning for stress testing. So be sure that you have everything in place, including the training and the tools to be sure that in your organization you can communicate between departments with the same meaning of resilience. So investing in education and training is something can be done practically with really low effort, just understanding your own organization and understanding where you're coming from. And there have been steps that we have done also with Kristen or with Abhilash. And it's also where higher education, like research, like in our case, or who thinks is more appropriate for you, can collaborate to make something that is useful for your daily job. Again, you may arrive to need model forecastings, but sometimes you just need to understand who has been trained in your organization. Start with the basic, assuring that the basics are there. And I heard many times, oh, we know the basics, then you have a questionnaire for a certain organization at certain times, and you see that there are 5 different definitions of resilience, 2 departments don't understand each other. So start from that. Then you build up. You start to build up within departments again, from who is doing response, disaster preparedness, disaster response, and who is doing adaptation. And you start to together. And again, I know also some other of my colleagues in this talk are doing actively, promoting actively these kind of steps. And it's something that can be done. Then in the medium term, in terms of what we're doing, teaching lateral thinking. It's something that each one of you can do it to some extent in your own job. So climate change, what implies? It implies that different things can happen at the same time. And cascading effects, the complexity implying it's not gonna be so predictable. So start to read different things, start to merge them together, and start to be more critical than before. So this is the key when we are thinking about future scenario, or even not so future, maybe just in a couple of years. Expect the unexpected. So prepare yourself, educating yourself, reading different things, and exercise your mind to do it. So we're talking organizational level. So start from the basics, go beyond. And individual level, what you can do in your role to develop your own mind to face better these challenges. Again, many people are doing it. Some of the stuff we are doing in research, and we did also, for example, with Kristen and Abhilash, are things that even like 10 years ago, or when I started my own doctorate in 2014, people would have laughed at me. They were not thinking they were real. Instead, there are steps in that direction that are practical. There are many organizations that are doing it. We can do better. We need to cooperate all together. So learning which are our own limits, and when we need to reach out to collaborate with somebody else. That's complexity, that's climate change, and that cascading scenarios. And I can go on talking forever.
Okay, well, we'll stop you there, but that's great. Thank you, Gianluca. And Miriam, I guess from your perspective, can you share, I mean, you did already share something about like a case study, so you kind of like mentioned that before, and I see you answered in the chat. What would you like to share with the audience today from your experience? Oh, you're muted again. Thank you.
So in Network Rail, we've obviously published our sort of sustainability strategy, and in there is a section on weather resilience and climate adaptation. And it's I think we are the sort of like leading railway at the moment, sort of in Europe, on the way that we're sort of approaching this challenge, and this is really exciting. And having published that, the next steps are to get things like the engineering standards sort of raised, so that that climate in some certain situations. So we've done an analysis of them all, and some of them are up to sort of like a resilient standard, and I'm not sure entirely what that means, sort of specifically for for signalling and things like that. Obviously we need to make sure things are sort of raised off the ground in some locations, that things can withstand heat, and obviously sort of withstand water, and those sorts of challenges. I'm not entirely sure about sort of lightning and things like that, and whether that has an impact. But lots of these things are being built into the new generation of signalling products, and signalling systems typically have a lifespan of about sort of 30 years. So, it's heartening that, over the next 30 years, in theory, everything should be replaced with something that is resilient. So, yeah, obviously more work needs to be done looking, I think, in more scrutiny at the civils assets, which are a slower turnover. I think for me, there's something around, when we've worked out our sort of vulnerable and critical locations and those assets, rather than trying to go it alone and sort of put more things into our business plan that cost the government more money, I think that there is something incumbent upon us where we need to engage with other people and see who else has an interest in doing work in that area. So if there are councils, if there is the Environment Agency sort of looking at other schemes, I think we need to work out, it's not just the value for the railway, but there is a broader value that could be contributed through a scheme. And I think we sort of need to change. And I think there's a little gap there in terms of, how do you, who would even fund that? Because it's not normal for us to sort of seek funding in that way. So yeah, sort of finding new ways of doing that would be really important. And I think the other thing for me is about giving confidence to our supply chain. So, again, sort of Network Rail has been criticised in the past for being a little bit boom and bust, and we promise lots of money and then we have no money, and it's very hard for innovators to come up with a new idea and sort of like mass produce it, because there's no confidence given that their investment in developing the product is going to be taken up. So there needs to be something where we can give more assurances to our supply chain that they are, going to be rewarded for their, for their innovations.
My turn to be muted. Thank you, Miriam. Kristen, Miriam's talking about, she mentions that quite a lot actually about partnership and collaboration. And what's, from your perspective, like you said, what would you like to share with us in terms of resources, initiatives, or?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of really good stuff out there, and I can give a few examples, I think, from London. I mean, you mentioned partnerships, and, so I think it's important because I think, resources and tools and things like that are really great, but I think it's even better if you have supporting mechanisms like partnerships that can help with capacity building and matchmaking and knowledge exchange and that kind of stuff. And I mean, it's something that the Climate Change Committee highlighted last week in their report to Parliament about progress on adaptation. They sort of highlighted that there was that gap in that type of subnational support to different organizations, and I would say that as a climate change partnership, but there used to be climate change partnerships all over England that would help to support that kind of activity. And I think, just in terms of some of the stuff that London has done, I think, we've got ways of looking at dealing with more long-term kind of risks, thinking about longer-term risks and dealing with the uncertainty inherent in that. So our adaptation pathways, based on the Thames Estuary 2100 work, that's still, I think, a quite pioneering example of an approach to, managing risk over, long time frames with uncertainty, being able to time your decisions to account for potential changes in the evidence or conditions and things like that. I think, we've also got in London, we've got an infrastructure mapping application that is being used, effectively to help with data sharing. I mean, we know data sharing can be a really difficult thing when it comes to dealing with interdependencies. People don't really like to share sensitive information. But we've got this mapping application that, maps planned and existing infrastructure implementation in London. And that's really to try to achieve better coordination among different infrastructure providers and others as well, on things like maintenance to prevent disruption. So we've also been able to use that mapping and overlay it with our sustainable drainage opportunity modeling, so we can identify where existing roadworks might be happening for gas works or something like that. And there was an example in Enfield where we did that and used the opportunity mapping to incorporate SUDS into a roadworks project. I mean, it's a small project, but it was less disruption to a community, a lower cost for the sustainable drainage, which will also help with surface water flood risk. And that also helped us, overcome some of the sensitivities about data sharing. I mean, it was just a very carefully and painstakingly, done negotiation between the Greater London Authority infrastructure people and the infrastructure providers. Now, there are other examples of some of the partnership work that we get to do. So we have a transport adaptation steering group that includes organizations like TfL, it's led by TfL, Network Rail, Highways England, and others, where TfL can sort of get some consultation on its adaptation plans, but also Network Rail comes along, like Miriam was talking about, the really great sustainability strategy, comes and shares that information, and then others can kind of take it up. And so, so those are a few examples, I think, of some of the good things out there. And of course, we do have London Resilience's Anytown model, which helps to visualize interdependencies between different types of infrastructure. And that was mostly recently used by London Resilience to look at Brexit risks to the fresh food supply to the UK. So these kinds of tools and resources are out there, and they can help in different areas and parts of the systems. But yeah, I think it's definitely really helpful when you can actually have some capacity building and support in the form of partnership coordination to help connect it up with real world needs.
Thank you, Kristen. And before I come to you, Abhilash, for your comments, I'd like to just draw your attention to the poll. So we asked the audience where they see the biggest gaps in available resources that they need to be supported with in their jobs. Not surprisingly, financing being one of the gaps always highlighted. But then also fairly, a quarter saying government policy plan and prioritization, and that links to what Abhilash was saying in the beginning, the building the pipeline. How do you prioritize which projects to actually implement, and then take them into so that they're bankable, they get finance and so forth. And then I'm really pleased to see that the linkages across the phases are the main one. Well, maybe not the main issue, but definitely a key issue, because we work in silos. That's kind of what we do generally, and so so that's great. And system thinking, definitely one of my favorite topics. He's also has got some votes. So thank you to the audience for voting for the polling question. And Abhilash, can I please ask you to add your own comments and views on this?
Sure, happy to. I think Gianluca, Miriam, and Christina have already alluded and put forward a lot of options and solutions. I mean, definitely UK is doing amazing work, and I also want to mention the National Infrastructure Commission. They have been doing some interesting research and putting forward some very interesting work around this topic of resilience in itself. Now, let me put a bit of perspective of beyond UK here. There are some interesting examples coming out. If you look at the emerging markets also, look at Indonesia. The government is moving the capital out of Jakarta, which is sinking at a rate of 17 centimeters roughly per year. And the new city is actually being built with a financing window of flood-proofing. So there is a lot of work happening. You'll see interesting thing happening in most of the emerging markets. There are the basic issues which we encountered and put forward in your earlier question. To some of the issues that I had mentioned on the issue of common understanding of infrastructure resilience, we are currently working on what could be what we would like to call as global principles for resilient infrastructure. And the intention here is to help use these principles as a guide to the regulators, but also institutional investors and the operators on how could you see infrastructure is actually resilient, or your investment decision is actually resilient or not. It may not apply across all the phases that you have, but at least we would like to target the decision-making processes that as much as possible. Gianluca has already mentioned about the stress testing thing. I mean, this definitely is something we had borrowed from the Bank of England. And we took it to, what we did with the stress testing is we took it to a different scale in looking at how can stress testing be used in looking at resilience capacities. Now, as I said, risk is not constant. So we have been always challenged with risk assessments of infrastructure. And because risk is not constant, risk assessments will not be constant. And it's far too complicated doing risk assessments every year. It's cost heavy, its capacities are very high, and so on and so forth. So we're now seeing the feasibility of designing a global stress testing methodology that could then basically look at interdependencies of infrastructure systems based on different scenarios, and also look at how one could actually derail the other. Regulatory frameworks are very close to our heart, and that's something which we have been doing in most of the countries, working with national regulators to strengthen the regulatory framework. If there was one thing that we would like to also do at a scale and impact level, it would be geotagging all physical financial assets, high value critical infrastructure assets, and overlaying them with exposure and dependencies, and mapping the interdependencies. And the one last thing that I would also like to say is, I mentioned about this in the opening, or maybe not, the issue of risk-informed investment, or the need to de-risk investment. Now, I don't think we have one solution to that. There's a lot happening around the TCFD. There's also work happening around the issue of risk disclosure. But when it comes to infrastructure, it's not that easy, because risk is not just at the point of investment. It's actually where there are many parts to it. But I think there is a lot that could be done on those particular issues. And yeah, I mean, I'll stop with that, and thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Abhilash. It's great contributions. Thank you to all panelists, really, for giving us your insights. We now are into the Q&A part of this session. There's a couple of questions that I can see in the chat. A few of them already been answered, but let me just get this one. What is the difference between climate proofing and climate resilience? Could anybody explain this? Not sure who wants to go and attempt to explain. Kristen, please, Jen.
I think I would probably just cop out on that and say it's kind of whatever you define it as, really. I mean, I think we tend to use these things a bit interchangeably. That could be problematic, I suppose. But I guess just any discussion about this stuff, it's probably just important, at the start to kind of define your terms. And if you do mean them to be kind of the same thing, then say that. If you don't, then kind of explain. But I think, like I said, I think earlier, there's no real accepted definition with some of these things, whether it's resilience. I mean, I've sat in conferences where, it's literally talking about the definition of resilience for 2 days straight. So I think, I think for me, the important thing is not necessarily that, you come to some very accurate definition of some of these terms, but more that you just make sure that you agree with the people you're having the conversation with.
Thank you, Kristen. So, you want to add something, Gianluca?
Yes, I want to say, I think, I know it sounds strange from an academic, but I'm against the overuse of jargon. What is happening is that, unfortunately, there is an overuse and of jargon on overlapping terms. We know that resilience have been used for everything and its opposite. That is not, I mean, the original concept was simple. So the only way we can see it is that first, have a clear definition, don't overask the terms. The second point is simple is better. And the third point is that I would say for myself, for how I intended your concept, I would say proofing is not really possible. Because whatever is coming, complex event imply is never gonna be proof. We are gonna be able to maybe adapt faster to problems that we were not seeing coming. And again, we are doing that. We are gonna be able to do that with things such as stress testing and what my colleagues were saying before, again, as a whole. Recognizing that whatever it comes in the next years, we are never gonna be able to predict everything. There will be always something we are not gonna be proof of.
Mm-hmm. And thank you, Gianluca. And I think, that's partially answered another question there. How do we ensure a resilient structure, or where I suppose, when can we say that something is resilient, an asset or a structure, I guess, or an asset is resilient? And I guess it kind of links in what you're saying, that kind of a process of adaptation, change is the only constant, isn't it? And therefore, we'll have to sort of do our best to prepare and, not just prepare, but also recover from, respond, adapt to what in this case, climate change. It is something that I wanted to maybe ask the panel as a quick question. If you don't mind, there's a huge, well, I would say huge, there is, and it links to what Peter, may I actually introduce Peter to everyone? Peter Wood, Peter Hall from Wood, actually Vice President, Global Director for Sustainable and Resilient Infrastructure at Wood. Thank you, Peter, for joining. But before I just kind of let Peter present the initiative of Race to Resilience. My question is, there's quite a lot of debate about climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and whether you're focusing on one to the detriment of the other, or do the sometimes it's the debate, and I I'm not taking any sides. I guess I want to kind of get the panelists' view on this. What do you think about this kind of what sometimes is presented as a dichotomy? Kristen,
it's not
shaking your head.
Not a dichotomy. There's no reason you can't do both, and we absolutely must do both. And I think it does kind of, and I think some people know it irks me quite a bit when it seems like people are saying that it's a zero-sum game. Like somehow, if you're going to do adaptation, it means you've given up on reducing carbon emissions, and it's just not the case. I just don't even understand where that comes from.
I know. The reason. I mean, I completely agree with you, and maybe other panelists want to say something else. But this is something that I hear so often that I think it's worth bringing it up as many times as possibly can, so that the message gets kind of across to people that it's not a zero-sum game. You kind of there's no reason why you shouldn't be considering both sides, and in fact you must if you want to do the best, when you want to make the best choices. I'm not sure if anyone wants to kind of chip in and say.
I can add on Christine if it helps. Indeed, indeed it's not one versus the other, and should not be one versus the other. But there is, when you look at the financing window, there is quite a huge gap between the adaptation financing and mitigation financing, and that mostly happens is because I think, and to a certain extent, why we think it happens is because mitigation is quantifiable. You can see the results with your commitments, right? The carbon emissions and reduction in emissions and everything else. Now, the moment you step into adaptation field, and also the area of work where we come in on risk prevention, it's not easy to calculate and see overnight results, and that's what leads to a gap in financing. But also, where does that financing come from? And I don't think ministries of environment like to spare that out, but it's a constant challenge in the processes of itself. I don't think the concepts are different, but it's the window financing where it comes from.
Thank you. That's really good addition to the debate. Hopefully that helps also. But yeah, so worth bringing that up as many times as I can. So let's constantly do this to ensure that that's understood. Okay, so at this point, I'd like to invite Peter. Peter already introduced you, and so we'd like to hear about the Race to Resilience initiative, and that speaks directly, I think, to the desire to have a greater collective impact. Over to you, Peter.
Yeah, thank you, and I'll be quick. And if Gemma, you can put a couple slides up. Actually, it answers the question you just had. So I've been seconded into the Race to Resilience, which literally is elevated at the same level as the Race to Zero. So mitigation and adaptation, really looking at it in both in the same way, at the same level of impact and importance. And it's the idea, and I was shown a slide when I first joined that was pretty telling, actually, that even in a 2°C world, so even if we make the net zero commitments, you're still going to have 2.8 billion people by 2030 exposed to high climate risks. So even with the mitigation numbers, you're still going to absolutely need adaptation. And so the two are together, and I thought I'd just give it, just a quick overview of, what if the slides are up there, but basically what the Race to Resilience is trying to do is by 2030 catalyze action, and this is where it relates to everything that was talked about today. So have infrastructure that's built that can drive adaptation and resilience and improve the resiliency of 4 billion people. Specifically from those areas that are most vulnerable to climate risk. So and that's the metric. So it's a very people-focused metric, with resiliency being the driver behind it, and connecting infrastructure to people. And they're focused on 3 different areas. So urban resilience, everything around cities, the rural aspect, so smallhold farmers, there's the whole intersection with land-based solutions and food supply, and then coastal are the big drivers in this. And so what they've done is and ICSE is part of this, is 25 big global initiatives that can have a significant influence in leading to that resiliency for people by 2030. So it gets all about members, partners, systems, pathways for resilience. So we're building the infrastructure that can last and influence people. So it's perfectly aligned with what you're talking about today. And in the next slide, it really highlights. It's very interesting on where these initiatives are trying to get to. So what we're trying to do, and that next one can pull up, but really they're trying to target vulnerable populations. So you're looking at initiatives that can build infrastructure, build projects that can really have an impact to people that are most vulnerable. So you're looking at Global South, Africa, other populations, Latin America, and this is just a few of the initiatives, right, that have been brought in that are leading on this. ICSE is part of this, but agriculture, just and rural transitions. There's a whole focus on insurance. You'll see something on mangrove alliances, ocean risk. So it's really interesting. Beneath each of these initiatives, there's businesses and on-state actors that can really coalesce and drive the metrics behind this. And the really interesting and exciting thing, I think, on the on what Race to Resilience is doing, it's on the same platform, same level as the Race to Zero, and we're trying to get businesses globally to basically align what they do to climate vulnerability, have plans to improve that, proceed for what are their plans. So it's more than just a pledge; it's actually a plan, and then to publish metrics that will be rolled up not just in the next COP, but also right through 2030. And they're trying to focus on solutions in vulnerable populations, and they're really focused on all climate risks, but the big drivers are heat, drought, and flooding are the big ones they're focused on. So it just kind of, I think, ties in really well with everything I was listening to today of organizations and pathways like ICSE and all the folks on the panels today doing this work, building infrastructure that can tie to people, that can roll up to the Race to Resilience and the metrics. And it really puts a great, point on why we're doing all this work. So yeah, I just started this work with the Race to Resilience, but it's pulling in a lot of partners, and it completely highlights how important these pathways for infrastructure and resiliency are. So that's all I had. But thanks for the invitation, everyone.
All right. Thank you, Peter. And we've reached the end of this session, so we hope you found it interesting, thought-provoking. It is really a pleasure to have all these good people on the panel today. Thank you very much for your contributions, and Peter as well. Now, one final call for, I suppose, input into our infrastructure pathways. We're looking for users that are willing to engage with us, and potential users, beneficiary of this knowledge product, to engage with us to ensure that what we're producing is is what you need. So if you want to connect with us or get involved, please get in touch at the info@resilienceShift.org. If someone of the team can put that in the chat, please. So we'll be really happy to hear from you. Or if you want to hear more about the Resilience Shift or ICSE or any of the topics discussed today, please get in touch. Otherwise, all is left, I think, is to wish everyone a good evening or a good rest of the day. And thank you again all for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.